Welcome to the Season 5 of the India Energy Hour podcast. This podcast explores the most pressing hurdles and promising opportunities of India's energy transition through an in-depth discussion on policies, financial markets, social movements, and science. Your hosts for this episode are Shreya J., Delhi-based energy and climate journalist, and Dr. Sandeep Pai, Washington-based energy transition researcher and author. The show is produced by 101 Reporters, a pan-India network of grassroots reporters that produces original stories from rural India. If you like our podcast, please rate us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the platform where you listen to our podcast. Your support will help us reach a larger audience. As India eyes its net zero targets, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, CCUS, is becoming central to decarbonizing core industries like steel, cement, and petrochemicals. While the technology holds immense promise, its adoption in India remains limited, hindered by cost concerns and lack of policy clarity. To understand the road ahead, we spoke with Mr. Atanu Mukherjee, CEO of Dastur Energy. From shaping early internet technologies to leading CCUS innovation in India, Mr. Atanu Mukherjee shares a compelling perspective on the need for supportive policies, financing models, and industry-wide collaboration to scale CCUS in India's energy transition.
Hello and welcome to the India Energy Hour, Atanu. Thank you so much for joining us here. We are going to discuss a very interesting topic, something that this podcast, despite existing for 4 seasons, has not been able to cover, guilty as charged. But I hope we'll do justice to this topic because we're talking with you. You have served in this sector for so long, and now you are at helm of a company which is doing some path-breaking work in India. So welcome again to this podcast, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's a privilege, and thank you for inviting me.
Before we get into the topic, we will start this discussion with you, as is our protocol, if you can say so. We like to discuss about our guest before we get into the topic. So we wanted to understand about your professional journey. As I mentioned earlier, you have had a long career in energy innovation, carbon markets. You're now at the helm of Dastur. What can you tell us about your professional journey? Where did you study? What led you to this sector, and what is exciting you these days?
Yes, Shreya, it is kind of very interesting in terms of my professional and personal journey and how it's evolved over time, over the past so many decades. And I must say that it's unpredictable, and it's opportunities that come at you over time, and you got to shape and navigate those opportunities to be able to make an impact right in the areas that you're working in. So my journey, as a child, if I start from that, I grew up in a very modest place in the heartlands of India, in a place called Chhattisgarh, Korba, right? And and I must say that I had a very privileged childhood. Not many people understand that now. Looking back, I think I had, because, those times in the townships that I grew up, which was basically, public sector townships. My father worked in a public sector company, and it was so wonderful, right? In terms of the community, in terms of the system, in terms of your ability to work with and feel nature, and at a very young age was just absolutely fantastic. And I think I was very privileged to have that childhood. And then I did my engineering and mechanical engineering, and then I did my master's in management from Bombay, and then I moved to the United States. A lot of my work in the United States was initially obviously around academics, where I went to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where I was working, on path-breaking work. I think at that point of time in computer science and networks, and I might say that I was uh, very instrumental along with my team in terms of laying some of the foundations of internet at that point of time in 1990s. And so that was very path breaking in terms of working with very different, very, very motivated, very, very bright set of people in the area which was just emerging at that point of time, which is the internet, which is taken for granted today. I also worked, towards my dual degrees in economics and management and computer science and engineering at MIT. And then I was working with a company out there in semiconductors, and it is a great firm called Digital Equipment Corporation in Boston, Massachusetts. And it was a pioneer in terms of computer systems at that point of time. And, I had the privilege and the opportunity to work on probably the fastest chipset of the world at that point of time, called the Alpha, the DEC Alpha. We were very, very engaged in terms of shaping the future of computing at that point of time, shaping the future of the internet. Had some great, what do you call, people to work with. This Gordon Bell, who's known as the one of the greatest engineers in the area of computer systems. There was Alan Kotok and some wonderful people. And I had the opportunity to learn and really understand, right, how things are shaped, right, in terms of innovation, how innovation moves ahead to the path of commercialization, how research is done, how products are developed. And then I was at Microsoft Corporation, in Redmond, Washington, um, working on, some of the, I think the best innovations in personal computing and the networks, and I used to lead their the Windows networking division, and we had the opportunity to shape a lot of things that he used today, right? A lot of things that he used that he take for granted in terms of networking and interaction with the internet. And so I had the opportunity to work again with some of the great people out there and great customers and great partners. And we shaped a lot of very interesting things in computing at Microsoft at that point of time in late 90s, mid to late 90s, which you see today and which is taken for granted, like I said. But that was a very interesting and path-breaking kind of like opportunity that I had to work with different kinds of technologies across different kinds of regions and different kinds of consumers or customers, which was really enlightening, I would say. And I think that this is where it becomes very interesting. Is that I always thought that that while computing and semiconductors was very interesting and very impactful, the society and the economies of the world have a much larger need, right, in terms of how people use energy, how people get impacted by energy across the world, right? And I think that that's when I had the privilege of meeting with a lot of people in this space and started working in this area in the United States. And then I met Dastur, Mr. Dastur, and he said, you know what, why don't you come? This was like 15 years back. And he said, why don't you come and shape the agenda for energy across the world as the energy future evolves and shape it for M and Dastur Energy, as we formed it at that point of time, and give leadership in that area to be able to really make good for the world and create a lot of impact in the world in terms of uh, the consumers who consume energy, make impact in terms of areas which have but extreme energy poverty, right? And make it more impactful. And obviously make it very clean, right, over time. How do you make it clean and so that the effect on climate is minimal? And so that's how it started off, right, 15 years back. And of course, I kind of like changed completely from a very so-called high technology industry, which was with chips and semiconductors and operating systems and software products, into something which is very different, right? Very different in scale, very different in science, very different in technology, very different in economics. But what I realized was perhaps much more complex, much more challenging, much more impactful, I think, than what you could just do in computing and communications and the internet. So I think it's been an exciting journey over the past, decade and a half in terms of being able to shape aspects of the energy systems, being able to work on different aspects of the new energy systems, being able to work on aspects of climate impact, and of course, clean energy systems, and being able to see how it shapes societies, how it shapes policies for countries like India, for example, how it shapes consumption of different kinds of energy at different cost structures, how economics or the affordability plays such a big role, right, in terms of how energy can be made available to the masses, how it drives the cost of living. It's a fascinating area, right, in terms of what energy does to the society, what energy does in terms of shaping societal prosperity, how energy lifts countries and people and regions out of poverty, right? And of course, how we should responsibly use that, and how we should responsibly produce that and distribute that in a way which has minimal impact going forward on the climate, and therefore it leaves our future generations intact and has minimal impact on them. So I think it's been a fascinating journey, and so I think that there's a lot of work that will be done, and we are involved in making and shaping some of those areas, which I think will have uh, probably significant impact over time around the globe. And I think a lot of that impact will be probably in India. And we think that India is primed for the opportunities that energy presents, the new energy systems present, right, for it to become uh, a large economy. Obviously, we talk about $5 trillion economy, but I think it could be larger. I think it's in the tipping point in terms of a GDP per capita to become one of the largest, prosperous nations over time, obviously, in the world. And energy will be a key component of shaping that. And so we're excited about what can be done in India, what is being done right now, and what are the possibilities, and how it can impact society and the economy and the companies in a very meaningful and in a very transformational manner. So that's, I think, a short kind of like, hopefully short sketch of of my journey.
Great. And it's very interesting to note that while you're currently working in carbon capture, you come from the coal belt of this country in Chhattisgarh. Just very curious to know, have you had any close experience, observing the coal supply chain from the state that you are? Did it shape your career choices or anything? You went on to work with some of the marquee names in the sector, but have you had any close shave with the coal industry in any way before, Dastur?
Yes, yes. So I'm so again. This is this is kind of a little old, but at that point of time, we didn't have Coal India Limited. We had something called the National Coal Development Corporation (NCDC), right? And NCDC was the controlling corporation which used to manage coal, coal manufacture production from a state perspective. And so yes, I did work, as a kid, with the I used to go to the Gevra coal mines, for example, to see how the blasting used to happen, for example, how surface mining happens. I used to go to the National Thermal Power Corporation in NTPC. I had one of the first few plants, in Chhattisgarh, right? If those are the first plants that came up for NTPC, the large scale super thermal power plants, and how coal would be shipped and how coal would be utilized in the most effective manner to make NTPC plants work at that point of time. I saw that as a kid, and I and I had a lot of friends, who were tribals, and I used to make friends with all these kids, who were basically tribals. And in fact, I call myself a tribal for that matter from Chhattisgarh. But that gave me a lot of learning on how those families worked in coal mines, for example, what uh, what affected them, right, in terms of things which were good and things which were bad, right? So one of the things, as you might know, and what I saw, and what I can tell you now, based on what I saw, is that belt, Chhattisgarh, that Korba, Bilaspur, right, that belt, right? One of the biggest drivers of prosperity, and people, think this to be counterintuitive, right? Biggest drivers of prosperity in the, when I was a kid at 70s, 80s, right, was basically coal and the coal-related industries. That is what brought all this tribal poverty and the tribal into and translated that into, to some degree, tribal prosperity, right? And I think it had a huge, huge impact, right, in that belt in terms of lifting millions of people, right, out of the situation that they were in, right, into the next level of consumption, next level of, I won't say prosperity, but next level out of poverty, right? But again, the flip side, if you look today, is the bad side of coal, right? Which when you use coal the way that we used to for the past many, many decades and still continue to, it has a huge impact in terms of pollution. It's got a huge impact in terms of carbon emissions, and that has a significant impact, right, on the society and in that region, and they're suffering for that right now. So this is a double-edged sword. On one hand, you want to what you call drive, you want to lift millions of people and utilize the coal endowment, which is the right thing to do at that point of time, into taking people out and into the economy at a more prosperous level. But on the other hand, you also create this situation where there is a lot of pollution that is generated as the scale increases. There's a lot of CO2 emissions that happen. There's a lot of mining wastelands that affect land use. And over time, that becomes really problematic and affecting society, the very prosperity that you've created. So being able to balance both these things, right, in the right way is one of the biggest challenges that India faces today, is how do we leverage the endowments that we have, coal endowments that we have, for example, while ensuring that we do not create significant health hazards, significant climate hazards, significant future intergenerational hazards for our children. This is the other big challenge. And that is possible, very possible, but how you do that, there are different ways of doing that. So I think one of my biggest learnings when I look back is when as a child, when I went to these mines and kind of like, worked with these folks, the tribal friends of mine, and we used to call them uncle aunties at that point of time, used to work in the NCDC and then the plants and the NTPCs, learned a lot of things on how these things work, how coal-based industries work, and how it creates the impact that it does. But it also has got a big downside in terms of what it does. So I think that was a learning at a very young age, which I think has stayed with me, and that probably is the reason why I was so much interested in, really advancing the new energy frontiers, as I call it today.
Yes, fascinating. And you found your way back into the sector somehow now to capture the carbon. I have a lot of puns in my mind, but let me go ahead and first of all, ask you if you can explain CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, short form CCUS. If you can explain to our listeners what exactly does it entail? The image that comes to anyone's mind when you say carbon capture is very different to what actually happens. So if you can explain how this segment functions, and what technology is at play, what are we looking at, and most importantly, how efficient it is.
Right, right. So let me give you some context on this. As the name suggests, uh, carbon capture essentially is a mechanism by which you use certain kind of technologies which enable you to suck the carbon dioxide that is coming out of an industrial production stack, for example. So, for example, if you look at a thermal power plant, you've got a lot this long what you call chimneys, and these chimneys belch out the CO2 right into the atmosphere. So instead of belching out CO2, if you have a mechanism before it goes out to the atmosphere, which absorbs the CO2 from the flue gas, right, or the gas that is coming out of burning the coal. If you absorb the CO2 and release the gas without the CO2, you essentially captured the carbon dioxide from the gas that is coming out, which has got CO2. That is carbon capture, right? There's a carbon capture piece of CCUS, as we call it. There are different ways of capturing carbon depending upon many technological and economic factors. One of the things that is a determinant of the kind of technology that one uses for carbon capture is based on what we call as how concentrated is the flue gas stream which has CO2. So, for example, atmosphere, the air that we breathe, has got carbon dioxide in it, right? But it is very, very dilute, right? And it's like 420 parts per million, which is very, very dilute. If you look at a chimney of a thermal power plant, the flue gas there may have 11 to 12% of CO2, and so it is much more concentrated. If you look at much higher concentration, for example, if you got a plant which gasifies coal, called coal gasification plant, the concentration is very high, 90% CO2 coming out of the stream. So depending upon the stream, the concentration of the CO2, the technology will vary, right, in terms of its effectiveness and its economics of capture, right? So for example, if you want to capture carbon dioxide from air by flowing air into one of those large-scale, direct air capture units, as they call it, it's going to be very expensive and very large because the concentration is so low, right? But on the other hand, if you use capturing from the chimney of a thermal power plant, obviously it's reasonable amount of concentration. You will use a certain kind of technology, chemical solvent, which will absorb that CO2. It's less expensive, much more manageable, right? And can you manage that scale. On the other hand, if you go to very high concentration, like a coal gasification plant, you don't require capture technology for that because very little. It's just because the concentration is so high, 95% concentration of CO2. So you don't require capture. So the cost of capture is very low in that case, right? So depending upon the different kinds of industries that belch out or spew out a different CO2 with the thermal power plants, the steel plant, it's the aluminum plant, it's the coal gasification plant. They spew out different kinds of CO2 with different CO2 concentrations. And the idea is to be able to capture that CO2 using a technology which is based on the concentration of the CO2 from these different kinds of stacks. And then once you capture that in the most effective way, in the most efficient way, and that is where the trick is, you would then transport that carbon dioxide, to a place where you can either store it, which is what is called a sequestration. You can sequester the carbon dioxide just like you do, in oil wells, deep down in the earth. You can drill down and store the CO2, which will never escape. Uh, or what you could also do, you could take that CO2 that you have captured and then convert that into useful products. Now, that is the utilization part. Now, the challenge is just like capture, how do you do the utilization or the translation of the CO2 that you captured into value-added products like a methanol, for example, which is a chemical, or ammonia for that matter. So there are different ways of doing different kinds of products, but the trick is how do you do it effectively, which basically means cost effectively and at a large scale. And that's where the challenge lies in utilization. So carbon capture, right, which is basically capturing the carbon dioxide with the right technology based on the concentration and other characteristics of the flue gas stream, and then transporting that to the right place. And utilization, which is conversion of the carbon into carbon dioxide that you captured into useful products, which may be methanol, which may also be something like you can inject that CO2 into under the oil fields to generate more oil. That's also one form of utilization. So that's utilization, two examples of that. And storage, which basically means that you don't do any conversion and you basically take that CO2 that you've captured in large scale and large volume and push it under the ground for it to be permanently stored. And that's got a certain cost, right? Depending upon the geography, depending upon the terrain, depending upon the location, and so on and so forth. So that is carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And this whole thing is called the carbon capture chain. And the cost of carbon capture, utilization, and storage depends upon these factors. What is my technology I'm utilizing for carbon capture? What is my volume? What is my concentration of CO2? When I'm utilizing, if I'm doing utilization, what am I converting it to? And depending upon what I convert that to, whether it's a methanol, for example, or some other product like concrete, the cost of utilization or cost of conversion varies and can be very, very high. Or if I say, no, I don't want to do that because you can only do so much of carbon dioxide conversion because very large volumes. What you would like to do is take the CO2 and then move it under the ground at very large scale, which again costs you somewhat, but not as much as conversion, much, much lesser than conversion. And that's probably the most preferred way of what you call moving carbon dioxide into the ground, because that has got large scale, it's got low cost, and the fact of the matter is, this whole thing that I just talked to you about, CCUS, or more specifically, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, is nothing new. This has been done for decades in different areas in the oil and gas industry, for example. If you look at the oil and gas industry in the United States, it regularly uh, takes CO2, captures CO2 from different kind of sources, and then injects it underground to store the CO2 to a large degree and also generate oil, right, which is uh, you know, the oil that's the United States, for example, that's generated, which can be then utilized for production of petroleum or diesel or whatever. So this has been done for a long, long time, and U.S., for example, today does about 50 million tons of carbon capture utilization for generating oil, which is called enhanced oil recovery. And so it's not very new, right? It's been there for a long time. It's proven. What is challenging is how do you adapt that towards industrial systems or different kind of generation sources, and you optimize that or make it most efficient from a perspective of the economics, which is very, very important, from a perspective of how much CO2 you can handle. Because if you look at CO2 generation, it's very large. It's in millions of tons. So you're talking about millions of tons of capture, millions of tons of CO2 movement, and millions of tons of CO2 storage, right? So how do I do it economically? How do I apply the right kind of technology, the different stages of carbon capture, utilization, and storage, right? And how do I do it at very large scale so that I'm able to address very large scale CO2 absorption or CO2 capture and then store it away for forever. So that's basically just hopefully a thumbnail outline of what CCUS means and the different elements in CCUS. Does that make sense?
Yes, it absolutely makes sense, and thank you for explaining the science in such a lucid manner. Thank you for doing that. And I'll just quickly shift to you gave examples across the board, but as I see it from the lens of someone sitting in India, it looks very nascent. At least in terms of operationalization of this technology in the country. How would you describe this landscape currently in India? There have been so many pilot projects that were done globally and also in India. There are several companies which are looking to dabble into it, but it continues to be a very nascent sector. So, can you explain the landscape, and can you also tell that? Is there any inhibition here in the Indian ecosystem that restricts its widespread usage?
Yeah, so I think that obviously, uh, unlike unlike the other technologies in the energy sector, typically renewable energies, which received a lot of what we call initial funding and fillip. Um, Carbon capture was not what you call supported that much initially because it had this a myth around it that it's not a proven technology, it doesn't work, and so why invest here? Much rather invest in renewables and so on and so forth, right? And so it did not get the initial funding to be able to be applied towards projects, for where it's where it will be utilized for large scale carbon capture and storage. So that was way back, I think 2000. I'm talking global scenario, 2000, late 90s, 2000s, and so on and so forth, right? So that was a challenge. Uh, and now, if you look at it, right, we have got a fair number of projects. People have realized around the world that without uh, decarbonizing the industry, we cannot get to any meaningful decarbonization, right, of the society. What basically that means is that yes, renewables is absolutely important, right, for decarbonizing or making the electricity sector clean. But if you look at the emissions in the world, 75% of the emissions are outside of the electricity sector. And if you look at that, industry emits about 35 to 40% of the total CO2 emissions. There is no way you can apply any other technology apart from CCUS or some kind of other technology, new technology, to be able to abate that CO2. So that recognition came a little late, right? Much later. That, oh boy, this is like a big problem that we have got, which we need to address. And so people started addressing that around the world, and it started picking CC carbon capture, utilization, and storage started picking steam over the past, I would say, 5 to 8 years, right, in large scale. So India also, we brought this to the attention of the the government, the Niti Aayog, for example, and the ministries, saying that look, India uh, is moving towards a 2070 goal of net zero. Absolutely fantastic. It is doing great work in renewables, which is also very good. However, India's growth, right, will be driven by the industry, right? India is in a stage where it is going to get turbocharged growth over the next 15, 20, 30 years, which will be driven by production of steel, production of aluminum, production of automobiles, production of fertilizers, production of chemicals, all that kind of stuff. All of these things generate a lot of CO2. And there is no substitute that you have which can replace these industries. So you have to live with it, right? So the only way you can decarbonize while maintaining economic growth through the industrial growth would be through, you know, carbon abatement using things like carbon capture at a large scale. That took a little while to process and get absorbed, but they finally realized that yes, that is true. And so there are two things that has to be realized. One is that whenever you do any carbon capture, utilization or storage, or for that matter, whenever you do any kind of renewable technology or green hydrogen or anything of that sort, there is a cost there is a cost to that, which one has to pay, which till date was not being paid. And so the question becomes A, how do you make that cost minimal? And B, how do you ensure that the country, the nation recognizes that this is a need for this for growing the industrial base of the country in a manner which is sustainable, and also ensure that that is adopted by the industry over time. So the industry will not adopt it if you tell them that you got to put a carbon capture system, which will cost you, you know, 1,000 rupees per ton, right, for CO2 capture, for example. They'll say, no, I don't want to do that. There's no law, there's no regulation, nothing. So why should I do that? It does not make any sense. So that's when we worked with the government, right? And gradually the government recognized that, yes, we need to set a policy where you say that, you know what, it is important to have carbon capture from the industry to decarbonize it and to make it grow, to make the industry grow in a manner which is sustainable and clean. And we must support that using an incentive, a policy incentive, which, it's kind of like a PLI, plus potentially a VGF, which allows different companies like a steel company or a cement company, or a petrochemical company to supply and adopt carbon capture equipment to be able to capture CO2 and then process that and store that. So that just happened about 2-3 years back. I think the CCUS bill is going to go through, probably. That's what my understanding is, that over the next, in a very near future, in terms of the incentive scheme and how it's going to be funded. And so by doing that, and with this policy movement happening, we believe that there will be adoption of carbon capture systems with the industry as it progresses over time. And India probably is going to be one of the largest, decarbonization hubs using carbon capture over the next 10 to 15 years. That's very, very possible. So I think the policy is very important to drive this forward, because it gives you an offset for the cost that you incur through a policy incentive. And it drives the adoption of carbon capture systems for large scale or different kinds of relevant industries, which will then help reduce the CO2 emissions significantly. So India is at an initial phase, and I think it's moved significantly over the past 2 to 3 years. There have been some pilots at small scale. We did a couple of designs for some large scale, what you call carbon capture systems, like Indian Oil Corporation. We're doing one more for Indian Oil Corporation right now. There's one for BPCL that we did. There's a bunch of others that are going on. So the number of opportunities and the number of people who are started working towards this in anticipation of the policy coming in is growing much more than what it was. And we think that you will see a lot of these going into mainstream over the next few years. So that is what the state is in India at this point of time. And obviously, globally, things are a little farther ahead, but not too far ahead. But we think that as this gathers more momentum, because industrial decarbonization will become a reality, will be a recognition of reality, that you cannot solve everything just by doing renewables, because that'll only solve 25% of the emissions problem. The rest 75% is still open. And so this is an important way to drive decarbonization and to drive sustainability forward in India and, of course, across the world.
Interesting. Wanted to also understand from a company perspective, now that it's in extensively doing this business, what kind of a scope do you see? What all industries, or if you can take some names, what are some of the companies that you are regularly getting interest from? Which area is emerging to you as a big business opportunity, if I may ask? Which particular segment?
Right. So if you look at the applicability of carbon capture systems, it's most applicable to industries which generate a lot of carbon dioxide, right? And they generate that in large volumes. So the abatement potential is the highest in those industries. Having said that, if you look at the set which the industry set which applies towards that kind of a profile is the steel industry is one large. The steel industry in India emits probably about 250 million tons to 300 million tons of carbon dioxide, which is significant. Okay. Similarly, cement industry emits a lot of carbon dioxide. It's probably about similar number, 300 million tons, a little less probably. Okay. Petrochemical industry, right, which is like an IOCL, for example, they emit a lot of carbon in terms of while the process, the crude into different kinds of products. The those are three. Then fertilizer industry, ammonia, generation, that generates quite a bit of significant amount of carbon dioxide, if you will. So, if you look at the core industries, the core basic industries which drive the economy, which is basically got to do with steel, right? Plastics and chemicals, fertilizers and cement. This is basically what drives an economy, a growing economy, right? That probably generates totally about 75 to 80%, right, of the industrial emissions, that come out. And so these are the industries that we work with. So companies around that we are working with right now, for example, is Indian Oil Corporation Limited, for example, IOCL. We finished one some time back, which is probably going to go forward right now in terms of its actual implementation, which is the IOCL, the Koyali refinery, which has got to do with capturing the CO2 from the refinery, and then utilizing that for, again, something I mentioned before, which has got to do with generating oil, right? Excess oil from the Gandhar vertical oil fields, which is near in Gujarat, right? So India has got less oil generation, as you know, and so if you can use CO2 to be able to push it inside the oil fields and trap the CO2 and bubble the oil out, just like what US does, it increases the oil output at a very low cost. That's one that we're working on. There's multiple ones that are going on right now in 5 refineries in IOCL again that we're working on right now. There's work that's happening, with coal gasification plants, and as you might know that the Prime Minister's coal gasification mission, which is kind of got a delayed start, but has got a huge opportunity in terms of what can happen using coal gasification from an energy security and affordable, cheap chemicals availability and power availability. But that generates a lot of CO2 and again, very highly concentrated CO2, like I talked about before. So capture costs are very low. So a bunch of coal gasification plants we're working with in terms of looking at how to capture and store that and make it clean. The steel plants that we're working right now, all initial stages, early stages of design, for example. There's been interest by SAIL, for example, in terms of looking at it as an option. We believe that there's a significant opportunity to be able to decarbonize the secondary steel sector, which is, as you might know, is one of the dirtiest steel production sectors in India, because it is the small what do you call steel plants which are operated by different kind of like small operators around Chhattisgarh, Orissa, Andhra Pradesh, and so on and so forth. But they generate a lot of CO2 and they're very inefficient, right? And so we have an opportunity to shape that sector, and we're working with the initiated work with the government in terms of seeing how we can shape that in the best possible way to be able to drive, the sustainable production of steel using this from the secondary steel producers, and that may require some policies that need to happen. We just finished a couple of initial work with the cement sector, and we just had, I think, a few months back in terms of how we can move the cement sector forward in terms of making it more efficient and less emissive over time. And obviously, a lot of the private players were interested to move forward, provided there's an economic pathway with the right kind of policy in place. And so that's another sector that we're working with. So the core industrial sector is the one that is most amenable to carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And it's very large volumes. And if there's the right policy support for doing CCUS, which I think will be there, we think that this should go forward in a significant manner to create a uh, significant emergence of the industrial growth, which is sustainable and manageable over a period of time. So that's basically just an outline of where we're working on. And of course, this is only in India, and then internationally working on quite a bit. Mostly in the United States. We work quite a bit with the US DOE, and there's one that we worked on with a large steel plant in the Great Lakes area. There's one that we're working on right now with Duke Energy, which is a very large power provider. It's a very large power provider, which generates about 70 gigawatts of power. And we are decarbonizing that using a combination of carbon capture and other technologies. There's one we're doing in Texas, which has got to do with creating, hydrogen, which is clean, but not through renewable electrolysis, but by using carbon capture from hydrogen that is produced from natural gas, which turns out to be much cheaper and much easier than doing hydrogen based on renewable electricity. So that's a thumbnail, and there's of course Middle East that we're working on, and a bunch of companies, in the UAE area on things around how to utilize the petroleum residues that they have and convert that into chemicals while capturing the carbon dioxide for generating more oil from the old aging oil fields. There's one that we're working on in terms of how we create clean methanol from waste petroleum residues, and that way we are making methanol very clean, which can be then utilized for maritime shipping. As you might know, maritime shipping is also very emissive. And so, what you want to do out there is really generate the methanol to be able to use by ships, so that the change from the current emissive, diesel and maritime fuel onto methanol-like fuel, which has got much lesser emission and also cheaper, right? In this case, it also happens to be cheaper. So those are some of the examples of work that we're doing in India and outside of India, and we think that there's significant other opportunities that will shape up as this area matures over time.
Right, got it. Is there any, case study that you can share with us, specific to India? You mentioned examples about thermal power plants, Indian oil, and case study if you can share from India, specifically, talking about what kind of cost benefits are these companies looking at? Maybe an oil exploration company or a coal company or a thermal power plant. Anything where you have worked with or something that you've studied where it had lead to maybe a higher production, as you mentioned in case of an oil company, or any sorts of cost benefit that has helped these company, maybe a steel company or something, if you can share that.
Oh, sure. So and again, the costs vary, like I said, depending upon the type of carbon capture, right, facility, the type of industry, type of company that you have. But having said that, I think that some of these are very compelling ones. So, for example, if you look at the Indian Oil Corporation, carbon capture unit, that is probably one of the cheapest cost of capture in the world that we designed, right? And if you look at it, right, the cost of capture, I believe, if I'm not mistaken at this point of time, was at about $25 or $26 per ton of CO2, which is very low, right? Compared to because the concentration of, like I said, the CO2 quality was high in terms of the richness of CO2, or the concentration as we call it. So we could engineer something which was low cost on capture, and the transportation of the CO2 also was nearby. 100 kilometers away is Gandhar oil field. So if you look at it, if I take $28 to $30 total in terms of capture and transport, and that's on the low side per ton. And then if I inject that oil, inject the CO2, I'm sorry, into the field for generating oil, typically, for these kind of fields in India, in that region, in the Cambay Basin, and so on and so forth, you probably would generate about 3 barrels of oil per ton of CO2 that you inject. approximately. It can be higher too, it can be lower too, but $3 approximately. So what essentially it means is that for $10, right, additional $10, I'm generating 1 barrel of oil. That is very, very attractive if you look at it, even without any subsidies, without any incentives, nothing. Okay. So that's one case where it tells you that if I have CO2 and if I can find a place, and it all depends upon specific situation. If I find places, for example, in Upper Assam, in Numaligarh, for example, or Koyali, or some other places, I can inject the CO2 to generate oil, and that reservoir is ready for generating oil, then I can have a very productive generation of additional oil at a very low additional cost, by capturing the CO2 at a certain cost. So that's one example. On the other hand, if I take, from a steel plant, for example, if I want to capture CO2 and transport it, uh, I can, and sequester it, I can do that, for example, at about $35 to $40 per ton, plus another $5 for sequestration, $45 in India, right? That's about the range that you're talking about. However, one that we're talking about right now, which has got significant benefits, is that what I could also do, which is what you're talking about in steel, and this can transform the Indian steel industry, by the way, okay, which you're talking about at the very highest levels at this point of time. What I could also do is that I could take the waste gases that are coming out of a steel plant, existing steel plant, at very large volumes. I can not only capture the CO2, but I could separate the gases to extract the useful gas, which is hydrogen, by the way, and utilize that, which I burn away today. I can utilize that to create something called direct reduced iron, which is basically high quality iron with low CO2. So I'm complementing my iron production by extracting useful gas from the exit flue gas stream while I'm taking the CO2 out, right, and separating it out and then sequestering it. So even if I take the cost of CO2 and for separation and sequestration and compare that to the value that they create by extracting the useful gas to create direct reduced value added iron, which is utilization, my benefits are significantly more than the cost of extraction and separation of CO2 and sequestering it or storing it at even $45 per ton. So those are two examples, for example, to give you an idea of what it looks like. It'll not always be the case. If I take a CO2 capture from a power plant, for example, that's going to cost me probably in India around 35, 40, same 35, maybe $40, a little more. And but I cannot do anything with that CO2 apart from sequestering it, right? And if I do sequester that, my cost of power goes up, right? Because the cost of CO2 that needs to be added to the cost of power now. So unless I have an incentive to offset that cost, my cost of power will go up, just like it does for renewables, any other what you call mechanism. So the different scenarios, depending upon the use on how you capture CO2, what you do with the extracted value from the gas that you have, apart from CO2 capture, dictates how the cost benefits shape out in different scenarios, in different regions for different kind of uses. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, and very interesting set of numbers you shared today on how just with $10 you can save so much of barrels of oil. Very interesting numbers. I like to now just shift from technology to the policy part. CCUS continues to be a very voluntary approach in the country. It's not driven by any policy or any push by the government, which is usually the case for any newer technology in the country. If we could look at renewables, if we look at critical minerals, EVs, etc. Towards CCUS, such an approach is missing. Do you think it would be driven by market, or do you think that there needs to be a policy push from the government which would spur faster growth or accelerate the growth of this particular segment?
Yes, there has to be a policy push to initiate and accelerate the growth in this segment. It is unlikely that anybody would come in to put a carbon capture unit or carbon capture extension to its plant voluntarily because of the perceived risks, because of the uncertainty in the perceived benefits, and because of the perceived costs and the real costs. So there has to be a policy push, and that's what we worked on in 21 22 with Niti Aayog in terms of shaping the policy, right? So you may have want to have a look at that. It's available publicly. It's one of the, I think, how should I say, one of the most popular policy document that's viewed around the world in terms of a direction on how a nation like India can adopt CCUS at large scale over a period of time effectively, while supporting it with the right policy without causing any significant impact on the budget or the exchequer. So, so that policy has been designed in a way which allows for capture at large scale, while compensating the emitter who puts the capture equipment and the capture system and the capture technology and the capture plant at a certain rate. Based on per ton of CO2 that's extracted and sequestered or converted for that matter. So that has been outlined very clearly, and that's what is being utilized, I believe, in terms of framing the CCUS, policy into an initiative. In fact, last July, under the Prime Minister's Scientific Advisory Council, we were a part of that. There's a CCUS mission that was established, which will take this forward. It is anchored right now, I believe, by the Power Ministry to take it forward in terms of an actual you know, budget goal in terms of what needs to be done and how it should be what you call implemented forward. So policy is fundamentally important to what you call initiate this and move this forward in terms of adoption in the country. And I think that's got a fair start, and I think it'll move forward in terms of how CCUS is implemented at large scale in India. So I think that's where it is in terms of at this point of time. But I think the opportunities are very very large. In terms of what can be done, and also one of the things that we I didn't mention. One of the key things that demurs governments from taking such policy initiatives is the cost of doing that, right? So if you're able to finance that in a way which is not affecting you significantly, then it becomes a win-win for everybody. And so what we did was we designed a body, a quasi government, semi-private government body called the Carbon Capture Finance Corporation. And the CCFC essentially drives the support of the incentives, right, based on pooling in concessional and as well as discounted bonds, climate bonds and other bonds supported by the sovereign guarantee of India, right? And then utilizes that to generate what you call additional delta spread on the capital to support these incentives that you give out. We also said that what we would do is utilize a part of the cess, for example, that is utilized in India, for example, in the coal cess, 400 rupees per ton, I believe, is the coal cess, which is used for GST today. If you redirect it properly towards supporting CCUS, CCFC for providing incentives, and combine that with all these different kinds of bonds and financial instruments that you can mobilize, whose goal is to support incentives for carbon capture, it would work out in a budget neutral manner where the CCFC or the Carbon Capture Finance Corporation drives and anchors the entire mechanism of incentive implementation and incentive administration across the entire spectrum of the carbon capture that is being done in India, right? So that's a very powerful way of doing that. And then we said that, look, what we need to do, and that's in the policy document, is that you need to obviously look at it not only from how do you know what price do you want to pay, right, for the incentive? Is $30, $20, $50? One way to do that is essentially carbon markets, right, that they have done in Europe. But again, we must understand that while it is important to have carbon markets to determine the price or discover the price, which the CCFC can use to be able to disburse the incentives, carbon markets per se does not mean a carbon tax, right? So we are very careful in making the distinction where we say that carbon markets and carbon taxes are different. We may use carbon markets to discover the price which can be administered and paid through CCFC over intergenerations, as we call it, over a period of time, uh, and not the consumer. So, by combining the right kind of financial mechanisms and instruments, along with the right kind of market mechanisms for signaling and information, we should be able to do this in a budget neutral manner, which does not affect the government in any way in terms of additional costs or the taxpayer anyway in terms of additional taxes right now. So that's kind of like our thought and the driver in terms of how it should go forward.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a very comprehensive take, and I also think that the way this country operates and how new technologies take so much time to absorb across the SIP system or maybe trickle down. This much push is necessary. I We are nearing close to the closure of this particular discussion, so I want to close this discussion with something that is on everyone's mind these days. What would be the impact of the current U.S. dispensation under Donald Trump and whatever decisions he's taking in favor of fossil fuel or against the clean tech industry? What kind of impact do you think it will have on the CCUS industry as a whole? Because it was just catching up, investment just started flowing in, and now there is so much cloud over anything related to this segment. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think we have seen this across different regimes, uh, political regimes across the globe. And these kind of what you call political stances by different countries will be taken based on their preferences and their beliefs. However, having said that, the momentum in terms of clean of energy transformation, right? Energy transformation, which includes clean energy systems, is very large across the world. It's very very large, right? So while the political dispensations or political what you call, or stances of a country might affect for some time certain regions, largely what we have seen till now and what we think will happen in the future also, I think largely it'll be not that significantly affected. There obviously will be bumps. Yes, there obviously will be some changes, but I don't believe so that it'll have significant impact in terms of large scale disruption of the pathways in terms of clean energy systems, energy transformations, and so on and so forth. Because a lot of the commitments across the world has been made, and those are multi year commits, which you cannot undo right away. It's difficult to undo that. Very difficult to undo that. As not only in the United States but also obviously across the world. So you cannot undo that. And if you look at it, right, going forward, um, we know that and we believe that that fossil or hydrocarbons, as I call it, will be an integral part, right, of the global economy, whether we like it or not, right? That is, there's no substitute to that, and so significant part of the energy system will be global economy. In the global economy will be hydrocarbons. So therefore, uh, as you move forward, while there would be what you call reservations from certain political regimes in terms of why should we clean it, but end of the day, if the cost of reduction of or abatement of CO2 becomes lesser and lesser over time, it becomes I was a minor, but it becomes a lesser factor in terms of implementation of sustainable systems like carbon capture systems with hydrocarbons. So I think, given that stance, given that situation, and given the fact that there's a significant momentum across the world, including United States, and the significant momentum also in terms of hydrocarbons being a significant player in the overall energy landscape, and given the fact that cost of abatement will drop over time as scale increases, the likelihood that any specific political stance or a national or regional stance will significantly change the pathway that we are on, it's probably going to be much less. Okay, so that's what I think. That's what we think how this is going to shape out.
Yes, and like it is with every other sector right now, it's a wait and watch mode. So we'll see. You're absolutely right how it pans out. But I like to believe, given the state of affairs across the sectors, across the state of affairs when it comes to climate action, I hope that CCUS catches much pace. On that note, thank you so much for talking with us. It was a comprehensive chat, and I learned so much about CCUS from you. I understood so much about carbon capture, and I hope our listener did too. Thanks again for joining us here at the Indian Energy Hour.
Oh, thank you, Shreya. It was a pleasure talking to you, and we'll hopefully catch up again sometime soon.
Definitely. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the India Energy Hour. Subscribe to this channel to never miss an update. To drop us a feedback, visit our website or write to us at theindiaenergyhour@gmail.com. We are on Twitter. You can follow at TIEH_podcast and get in touch with the two hosts at Shreya_J and at Sandeep Pai.